All right, hi there. I'm Jeff Henriquez. Hey, welcome. And I teach in the Department of Psychology. I teach introductory psychology and statistics, as part of our gateway classes. And I'm here today to talk about clicker questions. Let's see, I should turn this on if I wanted to actually advance my slides. But I have been using clickers for a while, and I thought that I would give us all an opportunity to collect some responses here. So if you push the button at the bottom of your clicker, it'll turn it on, and then you choose a response. And when we do this, I get a little tracking on my screen here, letting me know, hopefully, that people have been responding. You should get a green light when we do this.
I think I might have already. It's probably turned off again.
Oh, if it powers here, let me give you a new one. I did bring spare batteries.
No battery flashing.
Okay, yes, there you go.
All right. I'll load again.
Please. Okay, look at that, yay. All right, so I ask a question like this in class, and then I can put it up on the screen. So yes, why 100% of you have had this experience? What a surprise. Okay, here's another question for you. And actually, one of the things I have found from my students is they would rather that I just like keep my mouth shut, not read them the questions because they can read it faster than I can. So it's like, okay, most of the time I don't say anything. And I'm always trying to assess like what the number of students are who've got their clickers. But then here we go. We've got 75% of you choosing all of the above. So students aren't paying attention. They don't want to participate. They don't want to reveal that they don't know the answer. Yeah, those are all reasons why students don't use clickers. And in fact, that's the reason why I began using clickers. I started back in 2004, not because I had this great idea that it would be a useful thing to do, but publishers had discovered student response systems and were trying to market it with textbooks. And I just decided I would give it a try just to see what happened. I got an infrared system that's kind of like the remotes that you have for your TV. So you've got to actually hit a target. And so I teach in a large lecture hall in psychology, and you can still see the little receivers scattered around the room. And when I would ask a question, students would be pointing, trying to hit the target, and it would take like about 2 minutes or so to get responses from the entire class. But I could do that. I'd show the responses, and basically as I started, I was really just replicating what I had done before in class, which was every now and then I would ask a question and ask for a show of hands. And my typical strategy was, how many people think A, B, C? How many people don't want to raise their hands? Right? That was always my last option. And so I just changed those questions into clicker questions. Okay. So I was doing 1 or 2 questions during a class, not even every single class. Then as the university was starting to make a decision in 2006 about adopting a clicker system, I took a year off from using clicker, or a semester off from using clickers, but still had the questions that I had built in because I was anticipating the CPS system coming online. And that new system was a radio frequency system, which meant that you didn't have to hit a target. It just, it picked up the remote. So I could then get 200 responses in 30 seconds. So it made things go faster.
What would you say that the percentage of the students who actually did it, either both tried and failed, or I'm sorry, the ones that succeeded,
Yeah.
maybe you can tell the percentage that succeeded in getting their target either chose to and succeeded, or I guess they would chose to. So not counting the ones who didn't want to participate, and not counting the ones who tried but didn't do it. Or was there a difference between that and like the RF ones, the IR and the IR?
Oh, that I'm not sure if there's it was a difference between the devices.
Okay.
I mean, some manufacturers were suggesting, well, if you go to radio frequency, that students can cheat. They'll bring in multiple clickers and respond for their friends.
Yeah.
And it does happen. I have seen people with like more than one clicker. I was like, why? I mean, I think I have it somewhere in my slides, but I do use clickers to track attendance. But it's a low stakes thing. Basically, they have to use their clickers in just 10 classes, and then they get 5 points of credit. So, I mean, I do that because I don't want to deal with the situation of, oh, I forgot my clicker today, or the battery died. So, use it in less than half of the classes, and you'll get full participation credit. But I track their data, put it up online as a sort of subtle message to, like, maybe you should be coming to class. But it doesn't always work. Yes?
Are there clickers nowadays associated with apps on smart devices? Does that
Yeah.
does it do that, or would that exclude if it's students who don't apps?
Well, I have been asking the question. So the question for our video audience is: are there apps that students can use for student response systems? And there are a number of different ones. I mean, the university endorses Top Hat. There's something, I can't remember what it's called, that goes through Google. It starts with a K or something like that.
Google question and answer for the slides is one that they can do
Well, there's
with any
Kahoot.
smartphone.
That's what it is.
Kahoot.
It's Kahoot.
Oh, that's fun.
We had an active teaching lab on that a few weeks ago.
Okay. Yes, it requires students to have a smartphone, but these days, like 99% of students have smartphones.
Well, and
I have seen that percentage change over the last several years.
Top Hat's big thing is they'll take the dumb phones too. They'll take the candy bar phones.
Really?
You just can't do like the video. They've got options for like identify the part of the picture that this, the amygdala is.
Oh.
You can't do that with a dumb phone, but you can do it with a smartphone.
Oh, interesting.
And it also works on your laptop. So if you don't want, if your phone is dead, you can do it on Top Hat with your laptop as well.
We use Top Hat in chemistry, where we serve 2,000 to 3,000 students every semester, even more. And we purchased a dozen just cheap tablets for those few students who don't have a smartphone or laptop that they can bring to class. We've had one student use that tablet over the couple of years now that we've been using Top Hat.
Because your phone had died, probably. The battery was dead.
But so then,
No, this was
but everybody else is
legitimately
using the
because we didn't
system.
have it.
Everybody else uses the system.
Everybody else uses it.
Wow. Okay.
I was thinking that might be a better way to track attendance, because I think people are less likely to get disoriented with smartphones.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's
Yeah,
convenient
no.
wherever they are.
But
Right.
what they do then is they follow the slides from home, and they vote from home,
Of course.
because it's not radio frequency, you don't have radio, you can vote from
That's awesome.
anywhere. So you trade one thing for another.
Now you can also put in the IP
Right.
Yeah, you could restrict.
limiting restrictions so that it has to be at least on campus or.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's really, I do want the attendance data. I really just want to encourage them to come to class. So if they're going to cheat on that, it's like, okay. What was I going to say? Oh, the thing that I like about a physical device is just that they don't then have the distraction of having their phone out. I mean, yes, 50% of my students are texting during class. I'm fighting a losing battle, but I don't want to give them another reason to be
And that might
And,
be an
oh,
underestimate.
Oh,
50%.
yeah. I mean, when I ask this question, I have another category of, I do text in class, but not this one. And then I share with students actually that, you know, these responses seem to be related to test grades, but that doesn't really change their behavior. The one thing I wanted to also mention, besides not requiring them to use their clickers in every class, I do have enough points available so that for students who don't want to buy a device, or in the case of Top Hat, who don't want to buy a subscription, they can get their non-test points in other ways without sort of, you know, their financial issues sacrificing or impacting their grade. With all of this data, all these years of using clickers, I look at class performance data. I mean, I like numbers and statistics. I feel comfortable with computers. And so I've sort of gone down rabbit holes at times. But I have looked to see how students perform. And you know, one of the things that I found, at least initially, was my students liked clickers. They said it was fun. They liked the fact that it was anonymous because you don't have to raise your hand and reveal that you don't know the answer. And students pointed out to me that, you know, even if you're using like note cards with a letter drawn on it, you can see through the card. It's like, oh, come on. It's like, so this is anonymous. They thought that they said that they learned more because of the clickers. But in terms of test performance, there was no difference. You know, this early data, I can't remember how many semesters this is, but this is about 6,000 students. Semesters without a clicker versus semesters with a clicker. And it's a non-significant difference. So they think it's helping, but their performance doesn't show anything. But it didn't really hurt. So I kept using it.
So can I unpack that a little bit? They thought it was helping, even though it doesn't. What was it that they thought helped? Was it seeing the immediate feedback? Was it seeing that, I pressed A, but everyone else pressed C, so what's wrong with me? Should I rethink this? What was the?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I mean, all of the things that you're mentioning in terms of, you know, I'm getting feedback about what I do and don't know, I'm seeing what I know compared to my classmates, those are all real good reasons for using a personal responses or using clickers. I think that's really where the benefit comes in. But I didn't ask students, you know, what about it?
Okay.
But you know, I asked sort of how much they think they've learned in different areas, and so I had sort of pre-clicker data and post-clicker data. And so, yes, they think that they're learning more. They said that it helps them more. Yeah.
Do you have any assessments that are going on between exams that that you could measure that they're performing differently? I mean, I guess the clickers kind of are that, but it seems to me there's a possibility that maybe they're like learning a little bit along the way from the clicker feedback versus, you know, a couple nights before the test they learn everything and then they take the test, so the end exam doesn't really have a difference, but like the time that they're
Still distributed learning throughout.
right. I don't know if that would be a difference or not, but
I don't have that sort of data.
okay.
But I do have data that actually show that clickers make a difference.
Okay.
But getting back to what we were talking about earlier, it's not the technology. It's actually the number of questions. Okay. So just to continue with the story, because you know part of what John asked me to do was talk about the things that worked out well, what didn't work out well, and I confess a lot of this I just sort of stumbled into. I wasn't being very mindful. It was more like, oh, I could do this, or you'll see in a little bit. If you ask a bad clicker question, students can still learn from it. Because you get them to talk about, why are there these different answers? why is this partially true? Why is that one partially true? And it's like, I wish that I had thought of that because it seems like a really smart thing to do, and I tell students now that I do this. But I've kept those bad questions in because they've been useful. So students liked it, wasn't negatively impacting their performance. And so I continued to use it. I did start using the clickers in every single class, in part because I wanted to make sure students were getting their money's worth. Students are, well, you're making me, making me spend all this money, and I had to buy this for my physics class, and we barely use it. It's like, no, you're going to use it in every single class. And then also, since I wanted to encourage them to attend, I had to have questions. So I started asking more questions, and I continued to look at how they were doing. And so as I continued to try and find any evidence that these devices were making a difference, I looked at differences between different clicker systems. Because was there a difference between the infrared and the radio frequency? No. When we switched from CPS to iClicker, did that make a difference? No. But when I looked at the number of questions, that ended up making a difference. So early on, I wasn't asking many questions. I can't remember at this point, because it's too many years ago. I don't remember the exact numbers, but maybe 50 or 60 questions over the course of a semester. Nowadays, I'm probably asking somewhere around 120 to 150 questions a semester. So going from 1 to 2 a class to 4 or 5 a class. And so in terms of sections with relatively few questions, I had 2 sections with clickers, 4 sections without clickers. And then I looked several years later at 5 sections with a large number of questions. I avoided that sort of transitional period as I was sort of working things along. But
so 4 sections without clickers mean that you still ask the questions, but you don't have the clickers to.
Right. So this was in part and this also could be a confound in terms of the type of questions. I wasn't asking.
Multiple choice question.
Yeah, I was asking multiple choice type things, but I think I got more sophisticated in the types of questions I asked as I went along.
So maybe like questions that you could require discussion?
Sometimes, yes. And other times focused on some of the real sort of sticking points that students encounter in class. So when I did that, there was a significant difference. This difference between the few questions and the many questions ends up being statistically significant. And so
Is that a difference in letter grade?
what?
Is that a difference in letter grade?
No, it is. It is not. They're still sort of averaging about a C. Though these days, since we've changed our curve, this would be about this would be a D and this would be a C. But it's a less than 2 points, but at least significant.
So in some ways, the takeaway for this is the more times that you ask them to engage in questions, the more active learning they do, the more their learning raises.
Yes, yeah. And there are a number of ways in which this ends up benefiting students. So a number of different types of questions that I use in my class. A big chunk of the questions are sort of practice test questions. Students, of course, always want to know what the test is going to be like. And so, I tell them, well, I'm the person who writes the test questions and I'm writing these clicker questions, so you've got a pretty good sense. So they're the practice test questions. Sometimes I'll use a clicker question for a critical thinking question. I'll give you some examples of that. Discussion starters, you can use a clicker question, survey the class, and then use that as a jumping off point for a class discussion. And then you can also use clickers, and I do use clickers, to try and encourage good study habits. Part of that is just having them come to class, but well, I'll show you in a moment. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So let's look at a couple of test questions, but let's see. I forgot that this is called, I forgot what I put on my slides, which happens sometimes when I'm lecturing too with students. So these are sort of the reasons why it's important for students to get some practice. And I wrote this all out just because I know that people are going to be looking at this, just at the slides, and want to be able to, like, what did you talk about? So they get practice with the types of questions that you like to ask. An important thing for me is that I can coach students in terms of how do you read a question, how do you extract the important information, what are the things you should be focusing on. I can also emphasize the need to read the entire question, those sorts of things. The students get feedback on what they know and don't know immediately. They get this comparison with their classmates. So if they see that 80% of the class has gotten it right and they didn't, well, that's kind of like a flag. They don't have to feel so bad when, hey, most of the people in class didn't get it right, okay? We all had this sort of common mistake. And so it's useful that way. And then, I also think about these practice test questions as a way for me as the instructor to highlight the topics that I think are important for them, that they should make sure that they focus on when we're testing. Because of course, in a survey class, there's a lot of information that we dump on them. And so trying to, I took the time to write a question about this. This is something you should understand. So it's helpful in that way. So here's a question for you. So a study looked at the amount of time teenage girls spent watching soap operas and how sexually active they were. They found that there was a positive correlation between hours of TV and the amount of sexual behavior engaged in. And what does this mean? So this is a question where I'm asking students to, do they understand what it means when there's a positive correlation? Interestingly enough, this is real research. There is, in fact, a correlation between soap operas and being sexually active. And so, I give this question, people click in with their responses, and then we put it up on the screen, and oh, look at that. It means that time spent watching TV was associated with an increase. It doesn't mean that it caused. So that's, one of the things we try and highlight, correlation is not causation, so making that clear. Positive correlations don't mean positive. So we're trying to identify some of the misconceptions people might have about what a correlation is. So that's a typical multiple choice question. I teach statistics, numbers, okay? And at first that was like a little intimidating. How am I gonna use this system in my stats class? And initially when I was teaching, I didn't, but I figured, most of my exams are multiple choice and true false because I'm trying to get at concepts as opposed to calculations. Because of course they're gonna be using computers for everything anyway. So this is an example of a question that I use in my statistics class. In the context of analysis of variance, where you've got 10 individuals and 4 levels of your independent variable. Well, to be able to answer this question, students have to know how to compute degrees of freedom. They have to be able to realize that for the error term, not only do you have to take the degrees of freedom for the subjects and the degrees of freedom for your between group factor, but you've got to multiply them together. And so there are different mistakes that it could make in that calculation. Okay, they could just multiply the two of them together. They could do the degrees of freedom here, but forget the degrees of freedom there. And so we've got these choices, and then I can highlight. Oh, remember, this is how the formula works. So I've been able to use math problems. And I should say, just as a note in terms of writing clicker questions, that the stuff that publishers provide, by and large, aren't very good. In fact, my complaining to publishers has gotten me some outside work, because it's like, well, okay, why don't you write some for us? So for my statistics books, they're better questions than they used to be. So I mean, yeah, they tend not to sort of focus on application, the higher level thinking we want our students to do. So you've got to take these things into your own hands. Okay, so that's a computational question. You can use clicker questions as a way to get students thinking about an essay exam. Can they thoroughly explain a concept? And so this is an example of a type of question that I've asked students. Negative reinforcement is this principle in psychology where you strengthen a behavior by removing some sort of unpleasant or aversive stimulus. Okay, so when you take ibuprofen to relieve a headache, you're taking that ibuprofen gets reinforced because the headache goes away. Okay? So it's a concept that students struggle with because negative reinforcement sounds like it's supposed to be bad reinforcement. So I have these 4 choices, and I ask students to vote, and then we use that as a starting place, because none of these answers are perfect, and some are just flat out wrong. So, I mean, yes, you're removing an aversive stimulus to shape the behavior, but the answer is incomplete because it's not talking about the behavior increasing as a result of that removal. Negative reinforcement involves taking something away. Okay, this answer isn't explaining what it is you're taking away, because you can take away something good, you take away something bad, so that's kind of incomplete. So really, I mean, you have to sort of combine both B and C together to get a really complete answer. And so, I can give them this and say, well, how could you make it better? Why, what was lacking in this answer, what was lacking in that answer? And get them to talk amongst themselves. John and I were talking about Thinkpairshare earlier, and you can do that with clicker questions. I mean, when I ask a question and there's no consensus on what the correct answer is, I say, okay, so we don't seem to have any real sense of what the right answer is. Talk to your neighbor and convince them of the accuracy of your answer and let them try and convince you. And then we vote again. So I, again, was not sort of intentional, but it was like, rather than me just telling them what the right answer is, why don't they try and teach the person sitting next to them? Lay out their argument. Why did they think that this was the right answer versus not? And sometimes that's successful, sometimes not. But then you talk, then at that point you can talk about, well, okay, where are we getting hung up? Where are the errors happening? And so there's that. This is an example of a question where, again, it was a mistake on my part. I thought this was a cute question. And then as people are answering, I'm realizing, oh, you could make an argument for 2 different answers here. So defense mechanisms is this Freudian idea that when we have uncomfortable feelings, because it creates all this anxiety, we have to do something to cope with that anxiety. There are different solutions. So in this situation here, Susie can't stand Canadians. She claims it's the Canadians who hate us, okay? So Susie is projecting her hostility onto the Canadians, okay? But then when she goes out and smashes their bottles of maple syrup, well, that's a different defense mechanism. That's displacement, because you're targeting a safer target for your uncomfortable feelings. So, like when you yell at your dog rather than yelling at your boss, that's displacement. And so when Susie smashes the bottles of maple syrup rather than smashing Canadians, well, that's displacement. It's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah. So they're both right, and students click in, and we talk about why this, why that, and then of course they get really anxious. Well, are you going to ask a question like this, not this? No. If I ask a question like this, it means I screwed up, because that's how we got this question in the first place. I made a mistake, but I turned it into a learning experience. The bulk of my questions tend to be test questions like this, but there are other ways that you can use clickers. And before I do that, let me just sort of offer up some suggestions on how to handle these questions. And some of this, I guess, is stuff that I already said, so I'll go very quickly. But because you're going to be writing these questions yourself, because you're going to be dissatisfied with what you get from the publisher, try and think of the common mistakes that students make. Sometimes I get ideas from office hours when I'm talking with students and I'm realizing that they're really lost on an idea, and they're making this sort of mistake. So then I incorporate that mistake into my questions. The negative reinforcement question, where I had those different short answer questions, I took those from different makeup exams. Students had offered those as examples of describing negative reinforcement. And like, none of them got it. And so I was like, okay, here's a question, let's talk about it, type of a thing. When students have chosen the wrong answer, even when most of the class has gotten it right, take time to explain why the wrong answers are wrong. This is advice I was talking about. I got from my son, who was a high school teacher. He sat in on one of my classes and gave me feedback afterwards. And he said, you think 80–85% of the class gets it right, you can just go ahead, you don't have to explain anything. You still have 15 or 20% of the class who don't understand. So take the time to explain why their answers are wrong, not just, oh, that was the wrong answer. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, thanks, Ruben. I appreciate that, that helps. And then I already mentioned this, have students talk amongst themselves. When there's no clear consensus, then vote again. And on those situations where most of the class is getting the question wrong, that's a pretty good indication that you need to go over the material again. I tell students, means that I didn't do a very good job teaching, okay? So let's talk about it again. Let me see if I can make it clearer. What did I forget to mention? What did I didn't? So those are those sorts of suggestions. Okay, and then just a quote from Arthur Chickering, just getting at this whole idea of why this sort of feedback is helpful, okay? You get some sense of what you know and don't know, okay? So other types.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Based on that you sort of took responsibility for saying, no, that was my screw up.
Yeah.
Do you do that publicly in front of them? And then what effect does that have on the way that you teach and that they learn and that they accept it? Are they like, oh, you're such an idiot because you made that obvious mistake? Or do they see you as a human that is more approachable, or is there maybe both, a mix of, or what? Are there benefits to showing fallacy or showing?
Oh yes. Okay. So yes, I do acknowledge in class that obviously I must not be doing a very good job, or that that I've written a bad question. It's like, yeah, that kind of stinks. And I don't know for sure. The little bit of feedback I've gotten tells me that students appreciate hearing that I don't know the answers to everything. I mean, I tell students early on, you're going to ask me questions that I won't know. And I could make up an answer and try and look smart, but I know from experience that I'm going to end up looking stupid.
Right.
I mean, I have this memory from, when I was in college working as a waiter, and I didn't know the answer to a customer's question. I just said, oh yeah, there's no really, it's just some tomatoes on top of the dish, and it was throughout the entire dish, and they were allergic to tomatoes, and I just like, oh my God. I mean, 30, 40 years later, I still feel guilty about this. So I have that in my mind. So yeah, if I make a mistake, I own it. And as long as I'm not making too many mistakes. A lot of mistakes, and then they,
I have another question.
Sure.
So when there is no consensus and then you let them speak with each other, then you vote again.
Yes.
But do you see a pattern that, for example, in the second vote they approach the correct answer, or they still sometimes don't approach it?
It works both ways, unfortunately. I would love to have, they've talked about it and now more of the students in the class get the right answer. But I have certainly had situations where the percentages don't change at all, where they go the wrong way. It's like, oh, okay. So at that point then it's like, okay, let's stop. And I go back over what I was teaching. And I should say with the test questions, I vary them in terms of whether or not there's something, the questions relate to something that we've talked about in the current lecture versus something we've talked about a week ago or something like that. And with the questions about old material, the students are flipping through their books, and I tell them, it's perfectly fine. Just realize that when the test comes along, you're not going to have your book, so you're going to need to know these things. But
so how far back do you go for that sort of, let's revisit, and this is great distributed learning, right? To go back and sort of ask cumulative questions, or questions that they visited 3 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago. How many? Just to the last test, or?
Yeah. So it's like over the course of a 2 or 3 week period.
Okay.
My exams aren't cumulative, so I'm not going back to the brain at this point in the semester. I could probably do more of that old stuff just because of the role of distributed practice. I have some, but not as much as I would probably be ideal. Because I think it is helpful. And we of course tell people, even though we're on this new topic, go back and review what you were studying a week ago or 2 weeks ago. So yeah, that's a good question. In terms of other sorts of questions, critical thinking questions, there are different types of things that I do to try and get at critical thinking. Sometimes I will tell students about a research study and ask them to predict the outcome of the study. Other times I teach them a theory or a concept and then ask them, okay, what would you predict would happen? Or I'll just give you an example. One of the principles of learning that we talk about in psychology is what's known as classical conditioning. Pavlov rang a bell, dog salivated, okay? That's classical conditioning. Now, the explanation for why classical conditioning works is because the conditioned stimulus, that bell, serves as a signal. It's providing information to the dog about the fact that it's getting food, okay? So I talk about the different theories and then, information theory, why that works and what the evidence is. And then I ask this question about different pairings of the bell and the food. The bell is the CS, the conditioned stimulus, the food is the unconditioned stimulus. And if they understand this idea that the bell is providing information, then they should realize, or they should be choosing, that you need to have the bell precede the food for it to be useful. And so they should be choosing one of these two, and really the delayed conditioning ends up being better. So, and then I go into explaining why it's better. But if they understand information theory, they should be able to answer this question. And so we talk about it. So that's an example just of critical thinking question. Discussion prompts, you can use a clicker question as a starting point for class discussion. And when I'm talking about development, I have this question here about, should we intervene when a pregnant woman is smoking or drinking, using drugs? And typically I find 2/3 to 3/4 of the class think that we should interfere, or interfere, I should say, intervene. And then after I do this question, I ask about, I give them a story about a woman in Milwaukee who was arrested and incarcerated because her doctors didn't believe that she had kicked her drug habit the prior year. And so she was ordered into a treatment program even though she was clean. We talk about that, and then I ask them the same question again, but asking about the role of poverty. Knowing that poverty has an impact, should we provide food, medical care to pregnant women? And depending on the class, the numbers typically are a little bit lower, sometimes not too much, sometimes more. And we can talk about, why do we feel the need to intervene in this situation, but feel that is inappropriate in this situation?
So when you have these, and this is maybe slightly too far off topic, but
Go ahead.
when you have these discussions
Yes.
in such a large class, how do you, one, I imagine that there's one person that's like, I have a strong opinion on this, so I'm gonna be here all the time, and somebody else might be there, but what do the other 148 people do? Or do you break them up into a pair and share, a small group with the 4 people closest to you to come up with questions, or?
It depends. I would really like to say that I'm doing more of the breaking up into parent share and taking the time to have the discussions.
Which
But-
is chaotic and hard. I mean,
Well, I also feel tremendous pressure in terms of our shortened academic calendar
yeah,
and how do I cover everything.
yeah.
But I think the best way would be small groups because, my experience is I've got maybe a half dozen people who feel comfortable, talking, asking questions, and I can count on them to ask questions or to respond. I've got to work on the other people. And sometimes I will just, call on people.
And that lecture hall that you're teaching is not amenable to small group discussions, or?
No, I teach in a room with wooden seats, there's not much space between them.
Yeah.
I love it when all of a sudden there's this buzz in the classroom. It feels like, oh, yeah, they're connecting, yeah. So that can be helpful.
So even if it were a small classroom, like a discussion prompt like this might actually be better in a small class because you can have people be anonymous and for that initial thing, see which way the bar chart is going and then react accordingly. They're sort of warmed up anonymously and had a little opportunity to say something safely and think about it a little bit more, see which way the wind is blowing, and then maybe engage farther.
Yeah. So the last thing I talk about in terms of ways to use clicker questions, studying techniques. So 2 examples. One is, I asked this question at some point during the semester. How much time have you spent studying in the last week outside of class? And we get responses. And the last year or so, I get about 25% of the class who spent 0 hours outside of class studying. This is just a random week, so not with a test coming up. I get roughly another 25% who've done 1 to 2 hours, and then the rest is spread out. And then I talk about, credit hours, what you're expecting, what you should be doing, what the university thinks you should be doing. So, ideally, students would be seeing that most of their classmates are spending lots of time studying. That isn't the case. So it's not working in that regard. But it does give me an opportunity to at least talk about how this is what you should be doing. And then also, because I have this data that I can extract from my clicker system, I can correlate their responses or look at their responses and test grades and say, you know, the people who reported spending no hours or 1 to 2 hours, they did worse than the folks who spent more time studying. Maybe this is a message you should study, okay?
But this is anonymous, right? You don't really know who.
The clickers are linked to their NetID. So it's not, I can extract the data.
It's anonymous to the other people in the class.
Yeah, you're not raising your hand and saying, I didn't study anything.
I see.
But I as the instructor. So yes, they could be lying,
Right.
but I mean, I don't talk a lot about their individual responses in class, so I don't think they think about the fact that they're identifying themselves. It is interesting in my statistics class, when I put up the answer, I usually haven't turned off the question yet. And so as I talk about what the right answer is, everyone's changing their responses. And I have found myself wondering, does giving students the opportunity to change their answer, does that help in their learning? Does it make it stick more? Versus the situation where I've turned off responding and then talk about the question. That would be a sort of an interesting thing to investigate. And that just was like a recent idea. It's like, oh, I could do that as a study, but I haven't. Here's another example of trying to teach students study techniques. One of the things I tell my students is that when they're studying, they should try and think of examples of the different concepts that we're talking about. Okay, so I have a question in the context of my lectures on motivation about someone who has skipped lunch and is feeling hungry. Now there are different theories of motivation, and so I asked them this question about Phoebe, okay, and you know why she can't study astronomy because she's so hungry. Okay, that fits a particular theory of motivation, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But then later on, I asked them another question about somebody else who skipped lunch. And this person goes out looking for food, but for different reasons. It conveys a different theory of motivation. And I've got a number of different people, all from the Magic School Bus, if you're old enough to remember the characters, Phoebe, Ralphie, Arnold. I don't think any of my students catch it, but it's my amusement. And so I talk about the fact that we can take this singular behavior and come up with examples that fit these different theories of motivation. You can do this while you're studying. Think about a behavior or emotion and how it fits one theory or another. So I'm trying to model for them the things that they could be doing, ideally should be doing, as they're trying to master the material in the course. And then in terms of where do you sort of start on this process of writing questions? I guess I'd say what are the questions you want to try and address? What are the important concepts that are really difficult for students to understand? Sort of those threshold concepts where once you understand it, everything changes. Are there common misconceptions? Other questions? Yeah.
So you've shown that implementing clickers in your class has a small positive effect on grades.
Yep.
How do you sell that to your colleagues who don't use clickers and you're sort of arguing that maybe they should? If you're doing that, I would imagine that you would be biased.
My colleagues tend to be isolated from one another in terms of our conversations about teaching. It's really only in the context of the teaching academy or activities with academic technology where I actually get an opportunity to talk with somebody else about teaching. Almost no one in my department talks to me about my teaching. I'm happy to tell people, what I think, but I don't get asked, and I don't go out looking for other people's advice except in situations like this.
How would you do that?
Well, so talking about enough engineering,
Uh-huh.
we have active committees around this. Like we have a curriculum committee. We have faculty within our department that think about best practices for teaching. I mean, just one of someone in our department serves on College of June's Education Innovation Committee.
Uh-huh.
So within the COE, we're now beginning to try to adopt best practices for peer evaluation, peer teaching evaluation, and so on. And so I would imagine this would be something, if someone in a department is using this, that we could report back on, and we would say, well, what does the data show? And so in my department, there is a place where your voice can be at least listened to, whether or not it would be taken in.
Yeah.
But so I just assumed that other departments had similar active committees
And chemistry does as well.
as a unit thinking
Right.
about these things.
My understanding is,
We
But you
have something
facilitate
that
all
we
that.
call Teachers' Tea, where we get together every other week on Thursday morning at 10 o'clock
Uh-huh.
and have cookies and tea, and sometimes we have something programmed that we want to talk about as a group, but sometimes it's just getting together and catching up with each other, talking about things that are working, things that aren't working. And it's really brought the undergraduate teaching group together for more of a team feel.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and cookies are great, so, that brings them in if nothing else does.
I do want to be respectful of the time. I think that we have about 1 minute left. So please help me thank Jeff for the presentation today and for taking this opportunity to share teaching and talk about teaching. And please come back.
Yeah.
We'd love to have these discussions and have contributions. Please also take a moment